What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors reaches his absolute breaking point on live television? When years of frustration bubble over into an explosive confrontation that leaves everyone in the studio speechless. Today, we're diving into the moment Samuel L. Jackson completely lost it on Good Morning America. And trust me, you won't believe how this all went down. Make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story gets absolutely wild. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studio in Times Square. Samuel L. Jackson was scheduled for what should have been a routine promotional interview for his latest film. The legendary actor, known for his commanding presence and no-nonsense attitude, settled into the iconic interview chair across from Michael Strahan. The cameras rolled. The red light signaled they were live. And what happened next would become one of the most shocking moments in morning television history. Michael Strahan, with his trademark smile, began the interview in his usual upbeat manner. "Samuel, great to have you back on Good Morning America. Your new film is generating quite a buzz. But before we get into that, I want to ask you about some comments you made last week regarding diversity in Hollywood." Jackson's expression immediately shifted. His jaw tightened slightly, and there was a noticeable pause before he responded. "Which comment specifically are you referring to, Michael?" "Well, you mentioned that despite all the talk about progress, you feel like Hollywood is still playing games when it comes to real representation. Some people took that as you being overly critical of an industry that has given you tremendous success." The tension in the room was palpable. Jackson leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on that familiar edge that moviegoers know all too well. "Overly critical? Michael, let me ask you something. How long have you been in television?" Strahan seemed caught off guard by the question. "Well, I've been with Good Morning America for about 8 years now, but I've been in broadcasting for quite a while." 8 years? Jackson repeated, nodding slowly. "And in those 8 years, how many times have you been asked to tone down your opinions about issues that matter to you? How many times have you been told that speaking your truth might hurt your career?" "Samuel, I think we might be getting a little off track here," Strahan attempted to redirect, but Jackson was just getting started. "No, we're right on track. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. The moment I mention the word diversity, suddenly I'm being overly critical. The moment I point out that we're still fighting the same battles we were fighting 20 years ago, suddenly I need to be grateful and quiet." The camera operators in the studio exchanged glances. This was clearly not going according to the planned script. Strahan tried to maintain his composure, but you could see the wheels turning as he attempted to regain control of the interview. "I don't think anyone is asking you to be quiet, Samuel. You're one of the most successful actors of our time. Your voice carries tremendous weight in Hollywood." Jackson's laugh was sharp and humorless. "My voice carries weight? Michael, do you know how many times I've walked into meetings where I was the only person who looked like me? Do you know how many times I've had to explain why representation matters? Why telling diverse stories isn't just good business, it's the right thing to do?" "But surely you've seen progress over your career," Strahan countered, trying to find some middle ground. "Progress?" Jackson's voice rose slightly, and you could feel the energy in the studio shift. "Michael, progress is not having one or two faces that look like ours in positions of power and calling it a day. Progress is not putting a diverse cast in a movie and then having the marketing department whitewash the posters for international markets." The control room was likely in chaos at this point, with producers scrambling to figure out whether to cut to commercial or let this play out. Strahan, to his credit, pressed on, but you could see he was walking into deeper waters than he had anticipated. "Samuel, I hear what you're saying, but don't you think focusing on these issues might overshadow the positive work you're trying to promote?" That question hit like a lightning rod. Jackson's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His eyes narrowed, and when he spoke, his voice carried that commanding presence that had made him a legend on screen. "Overshadow the positive work," he repeated slowly. "Michael, let me tell you something. Every single role I take, every project I attach my name to, every time I step in front of a camera, I'm carrying the hopes and dreams of people who look like me and see themselves in what I do. That's not a burden. That's a responsibility." The studio fell silent as Jackson's words hung in the air. Strahan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly realizing he had pushed into territory he wasn't prepared for. But instead of backing down, he made the decision that would turn this interview into television history. "Samuel, with all due respect, Isn't it possible that sometimes focusing too much on these issues can actually create division rather than unity? The question landed like a bomb. Jackson's face went through a series of expressions, from disbelief to anger, to something that looked almost like pity. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Create division? Michael, are you seriously sitting there on national television suggesting that me speaking about inequality is what's causing the problem? That's not what I meant, Strahan quickly tried to clarify, but Jackson was already shaking his head. No. That's exactly what you meant. This is the problem right here. This is what I'm talking about. The minute someone like me stands up and says, "Hey, we've got some issues to address," suddenly I'm the one creating division. Suddenly, I'm the angry black man who needs to calm down and be grateful. Strahan's media training was clearly kicking in as he attempted damage control. Samuel, I think there might be a misunderstanding here. There's no misunderstanding, Michael. You asked me a question and I gave you an honest answer. But apparently, honest answers make people uncomfortable when they come from someone who looks like me. The tension was now crackling through the television screens of millions of viewers across America. Social media was already exploding with clips and reactions. But in that studio, it felt like the whole world had narrowed down to these two men and their fundamental disagreement. Look, Strahan said, leaning forward. I'm just trying to have a balanced conversation here. Jackson let out a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. Balanced? Michael, when was the last time you asked a white actor if they were being too critical when they talked about issues they cared about? When was the last time you suggested that Robert Downey Jr. was creating division when he spoke about mental health? When did you tell Meryl Streep she needed to tone it down when she talked about women's rights? That's different, Strahan began. But Jackson cut him off with a gesture that silenced the entire studio. Different how? Different because they're white. Different because when they speak passionately about causes they believe in, it's called advocacy. But when I do it, it's called being divisive. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of this unprecedented confrontation. Jackson wasn't shouting, but his controlled intensity was somehow more powerful than any raised voice could have been. Samuel, I think you're putting words in my mouth, Strahan protested. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're doing exactly what everyone else does. Asking me to package my truth in a way that doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. Asking me to smile and nod and be grateful for the scraps while pretending the table isn't still tilted. Nobody is asking you to do that. Jackson leaned back in his chair, and for a moment there was complete silence. When he spoke again, his voice carried decades of frustration and disappointment. Michael, do you know what's really sad about this conversation? It's that you don't even realize you're doing it. You think you're being fair and balanced, but what you're actually doing is perpetuating the exact same system I'm trying to change. Strahan looked genuinely confused now. I'm not following. Of course you're not, because you've never had to follow. You've never had to navigate these conversations while wondering if speaking your truth is going to cost you the next job. You've never had to smile and be diplomatic while people question whether you deserve to be in the room. Samuel, I think that's unfair. I've faced my own challenges. Have you? Have you really? Because right now, in this moment, you're sitting across from one of the most successful actors in Hollywood history. And instead of asking me about my craft, my process, my art, you're questioning whether I have the right to speak about issues that affect my community. The accusation hit Strahan like a physical blow. You could see him processing Jackson's words, and for the first time in the interview, he looked genuinely rattled. The seasoned television host, known for his ability to handle any situation with charm and professionalism, was clearly out of his depth. Samuel, that's not fair. I ask tough questions to all my guests. It's my job. Jackson's response was immediate and devastating. Your job, Michael? Your job is to make people feel comfortable so they'll keep watching. My job is to tell the truth, even when it makes people uncomfortable. We are not the same. I resent that implication, Strahan shot back, and for the first time, you could hear real defensiveness in his voice. You resent it? You resent it. Jackson's voice finally began to rise, and the legendary actor's famous intensity was now on full display. I've been sitting here for 10 minutes while you've basically told me that speaking about inequality is divisive, that advocating for my community creates problems, and that I should be more grateful for my success. And you resent my implication that you're not doing your job properly. The studio was completely silent except for the hum of the cameras. Even the crew members had stopped moving, transfixed by what was unfolding before them. Samuel, I never said you should be more grateful. Strahan tried to defend himself. You didn't have to say it. It's been hanging over this entire conversation like a cloud. The subtext of every question you've asked is, why can't you just be happy with what you have? Why do you have to keep stirring the pot? Why can't you be like the safe, non-threatening version of success that makes everyone comfortable? Jackson stood up from his chair, and the action sent a ripple of tension through the entire studio. He wasn't walking away, but the gesture was unmistakable. This was a man who had reached his absolute limit. You know what the real problem is, Michael? The real problem is that people like you think that because you're sitting in that chair, because you're asking the questions, you somehow get to determine what's acceptable for people like me to feel passionate about. Strahan remained seated, but you could see him struggling to regain control of the situation. Samuel, please sit down. Let's have a rational conversation about this. Rational? Jackson's laugh was sharp and bitter. There's nothing irrational about what I'm saying. What's irrational is a system that expects me to be grateful for the opportunity to be questioned about whether I have the right to speak my mind. Nobody is questioning your right to speak your mind. Aren't you? Because that's exactly what you've been doing for the last 15 minutes. You've questioned my tone, my approach, my focus, and my impact. You've suggested that my advocacy creates division. You've implied that I should be more diplomatic. If that's not questioning my right to speak my mind, then what is it? The cameras captured every moment of Jackson's controlled fury. This wasn't a tantrum or an emotional outburst. This was a masterclass in righteous anger, delivered with the precision and power that had made Jackson one of the most compelling actors of his generation. Strahan made one more attempt to salvage the interview. Samuel, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. Can we start over? Jackson looked at him with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and disbelief. Start over, Michael. You can't unsay what you've already said. You can't unask the questions you've already asked. You can't pretend that the last 20 minutes didn't happen. So, what do you want me to do? I want you to understand that this conversation, right here, right now, is exactly why these issues matter. This is exactly why I can't just smile and talk about my movies and pretend everything is. Fine. Jackson moved closer to Strahan, and his voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that every movie fan recognized. You want to know what creates division, Michael? It's not people like me speaking truth to power. It's people in positions of influence who think they can tone police how we express our frustration with a system that still sees us as problems to be managed rather than voices to be heard. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Millions of viewers were watching this unfold in real time, witnessing something that had never happened before on morning television. Strahan sat frozen in his chair, clearly realizing that this interview had spiraled completely beyond his control. The veteran host, who had navigated countless challenging conversations throughout his career, looked genuinely shaken by Jackson's unrelenting intensity. Samuel, he began weakly, I never intended for this conversation to go in this direction. Jackson's response was swift and merciless. Intentions don't matter, Michael. Impact does. And the impact of this conversation is that you've demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that keeps these problems alive. I was just trying to present different perspectives, Strahan offered, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Different perspectives? Jackson's eyebrows shot up. Whose perspective were you presenting, Michael? Because it certainly wasn't the perspective of someone who understands what it's like to be questioned every time you speak truth about your own experience. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken frustration, finally brought to light. Jackson remained standing, towering over the interview setup, his presence commanding the entire studio. You know what's going to happen after this interview airs? Jackson asked, his voice now calm, but still carrying that dangerous edge. People are going to say I was angry. They're going to say I overreacted. They're going to say I was unprofessional. Strahan shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing the truth in those words. And you know what's not going to happen? Nobody is going to ask why you thought it was appropriate to question my right to advocate for my community. Nobody is going to examine the assumptions behind your questions. Nobody is going to talk about how this entire conversation started, because you couldn't just let me promote my film without challenging my commitment to social justice. Jackson moved back toward his chair, but remained standing, his hands resting on the back of it. This is the reality, Michael. When people like me speak passionately about issues that matter, we're labeled as angry or divisive. When people like you question our passion, that's called journalism. Samuel, I'm sorry if I've upset you, Strahan said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. I'm not upset, Michael. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that in all these years, with all the conversations we've had as a society, we're still having this same argument. I'm disappointed that someone like you, who should understand the power of platform and voice, would use yours to diminish mine. Jackson finally sat back down, but his posture remained rigid, his eyes never leaving Strahan's face. You want to know what real progress looks like? Real progress is when I can talk about inequality without being asked if I'm being too divisive. Real progress is when my advocacy is seen as patriotic rather than problematic. Real progress is when the default isn't to question whether I have the right to be passionate about injustice. Strahan nodded slowly, perhaps finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just transpired. I think I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, Michael, but you owe it to yourself and to everyone watching to understand that this conversation we just had, this is the work. This uncomfortable, difficult, necessary conversation is exactly what needs to happen if anything is ever going to change. Jackson leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone of weary wisdom. I've been in this industry for over 30 years. I've seen changes, yes, but I've also seen how quickly people get comfortable and stop pushing. I've seen how easy it is to mistake visibility for equality, representation for power, progress for arrival. What would you want people to take away from this conversation? Strahan asked, and for the first time in the interview, the question felt genuine rather than confrontational. I want people to understand that speaking truth isn't divisive. Ignoring truth is what creates division. I want people to recognize that when someone who has succeeded in spite of a broken system points out that the system is still broken, that's not ingratitude. That's responsibility. Jackson stood up one final time, and this time it was clear the interview was over. And I want people to understand that my success doesn't silence my conscience. It amplifies my obligation to use my voice for those who don't have one. The legendary actor extended his hand to Strahan, who shook it with what appeared to be genuine respect, perhaps even admiration. Thank you for having me on the show, Michael. I hope this conversation helps people think differently about what it means to advocate for change. As Jackson walked away from the interview setup, the cameras continued rolling, capturing one of the most powerful and uncomfortable moments in morning television history. The studio remained silent for several beats, the weight of what had just occurred settling over everyone present. And that's how one of Hollywood's most respected actors delivered a masterclass in standing up for your principles, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's difficult, and especially when it matters most. Make sure you subscribe for more stories like this, and let me know in the comments what you think about Jackson's approach to this confrontation. Did he go too far? Or was this exactly the kind of conversation we need to be having?